Mr. Pleb, perhaps you're wondering why someone would talk like Bane to promote a betting company. Theatricality and deception are powerful tools to the uninitiated, but we are initiated, aren't we? Utterly woke regarding Esportspools and their fantasy and betting services? I didn't see their in-play betting until I had been in esports for 16 years, by which time it was revolutionary. They're a big site for you. Now, everyone needs a rival because, yes, great players exist, but sometimes great players exist without the context of other great players, or great teams exist without the context of other great teams surrounding them, competing against them. It's a reason why sheer accomplishments of finishing in first place, or the prestige of a title, winning the International, winning QuakeCon, winning an IEM World Championship, winning the League of Legends World Championship, winning a CSGO major, those accomplishments on their own do not carry 100% of the weight that they would if those accomplishments came within the context of beating someone fantastic, of beating a very competitive field, an opponent who was truly great in their own right. So accomplishments without the context of who you faced are not as significant, quite frankly, as many outsiders or more casual fans might imagine. This is why, if you are in an extremely competitive era, you can have very good teams who don't win the championship, but are understood to be very good teams. And therefore, it makes the teams that did win that much more revered and elevates the status of the champions, but also ensures that the status of the teams that didn't win is high because we understand the greatness that it took to overcome them, and therefore the greatness that then went on to win overall. So when you look, for example, at certain years in pro sports, so in the NFL, there was a Minnesota Vikings team in 1998 who were absolutely phenomenal. They went something outrageous. I think they were like 15-1 in the regular season, but they didn't even make the Super Bowl. Now, are you going to tell me that that team was worse than the New York Giants team that somehow won in, I think it was like 2013, wasn't it? The one where they beat the Patriots again. I mean, in no context. They weren't even the best team in the NFL. They were considered another fluke team. They had a nice run. They didn't necessarily beat the greatest opponents. They caught some teams sort of in the middle of building phases or the end of a good era who'd come downhill. Wasn't really all in all that great a team they beat. Wasn't really that great an era. The Vikings team was much better, but the Giants have a Super Bowl and the Vikings don't. Now, in the NBA, if you look at the Warriors team that lost in the 2016 final in 7 games, now, yes, there's certain context there of they had Draymond Green out for a game and Steph Curry was injured. And yeah, there was probably a choking factor. But them finishing in second place that season doesn't make the Mavs team that won in 2011 and beat LeBron the first season he was at the Heat, and he was a much more dysfunctional player in big moments, doesn't make that Mavs team better than them or better than them historically. Yes, they're champions, not better than them though, quite frankly. So you need to beat a rival, a great rival, to get that status as the best team ever or a truly historically great team or player yourself. Basically, you need to beat someone good and more than that. If you just beat someone who's only good, but not great, okay, yes, you dominated. Yes, you're great in some context, but were you thoroughly tested? Do we know how great you were? What you really need to do is beat someone who's not just good, but is great. You really need to beat someone, if you want to boil it down further, who was equipped and able to be great or to be the best themselves. And if you didn't exist or you didn't play quite as well as you did, they would have been the person remembered and revered as the greatest of your era or the dominant team or the champion. And you had to battle through that, contest them head to head with the best skills and overtake them in accomplishments or direct head-to-head victories in order to be the greatest. And that's what elevates you to that top status. So in Counter-Strike, one of my home games, the SK Gaming team of 2016 won 2 majors.
The SK Gaming lineups, both of them in 2017, won no majors. They won more tournaments, but no majors. Now, if you ask me which is greater of those lineups, I actually would go ahead and say I think the 2017 lineups, both of them, are actually better than the 2016 lineup overall because of the competition they beat. The lineups in 2016 that won the majors didn't have a true rival. They caught the scene at a perfect point where some of the elite teams had their pants down, as it were, and were able to capitalize on that and win championships. Now, would they have beaten those other great teams under different circumstances? I'm tempted to say they might have won one of these majors. Maybe they even could have won both, but I'll never actually get to see them do that, to see them elevated to that ultimate test and then deliver upon it. Because, as we know, Fnatic was winning every tournament, but then Olofmeister had his wrist injury, never came back the same again. Na'Vi were consistently great, and it took excellent level of play like Luminosity had at the IM Katowice tournament, and it took amazing play like Fnatic was able to show to beat that Na'Vi team. But Na'Vi had an injury with Guardian. They started to decline themselves. Their results became worse regardless of the context of what SK was doing. And so SK never really had that true rival during their peak there. Whereas in 2017, well, they had FaZe towards the end, who actually themselves were able to be ranked number one, who themselves were winning tournaments, who would have been the clear dominant force and established an era by now if it weren't for SK. Even if you go back earlier in the year, the other FaZe lineup would have won something like three tournaments in a row, have been in tons of finals, like 5 finals in a row they would have been in, if it wasn't for SK. They lined up with Alo and Kiyoshima. They would have been considered the great team of their era and superseded Astralis. Instead, they superseded Astralis, but then along came SK with Phelps, put them down as well, and then showed themselves even more incredible. That's why everyone thought SK Gaming with Phelps was odds on to win PGL Krakow the Major. So beating those teams means much more than if there hadn't have been a FaZe and they'd have just beaten Astralis, they'd have just beaten Streaky G2, they'd have just beaten good but not great North, or they'd have beaten the one-off NiP that was able to have a run towards the end of the year. That wouldn't have meant as much as beating FaZe in these circumstances, and hence their accomplishment wouldn't have been as great. You think of some of the other great teams in history, the NIP team that went 8-7-0. A lot of people aren't aware that Very Games team they beat was extremely good against any team even slightly worse. First of all, Very Games had matches against NiP where they were at match point. They were in they're not match point technically. They were at 13, 14 rounds. They could have won those tournaments. They could have been a great team. They could have shared the spotlight with NiP. Instead, NiP not only beat them, they dominated them and won all the competitions. So that made that more impressive, because if it wasn't for Very Games, that whole narrative of, the scene was much younger and more inexperienced and a lot of people didn't practice as much or play professionally. Well, Very Games did all those things and were very, very good and were excellent and consistent in their own right, but NiP beat them. So you think of the Fnatic team with Olofmeister and Crims 2014 to 2015. They had a whole plethora of rivals. In terms of their era, they had Envy as a rival. Envy could have established their own era. They had amazing results, winning different majors themselves, winning massive amounts of tournaments, lots of top fours. Obviously, Fnatic actually had their own rival that used to beat them most of the time, much as Nadal beat Federer, even though Federer's a greater player, in TSM, so we know that they could be tested. And then they had Virtus Pro, who always gave them close games but weren't able to beat them. So they had a whole bunch of extremely good teams in a very competitive era, and that's why you can still make a very compelling case. That Fnatic lineup is still the greatest team we have ever seen in CSGO. You go over to a game like League of Legends. I'll keep this Western because generally I realize we could give Korean examples, but people are more fans of the Western teams. So within Europe, the Gambit team, who were godlike in 2012 and arguably were the best team in the world, they still had CLG EU. Now, CLG EU, in a world where Gambit didn't exist, would have won most of the European tournaments they went to, would have then added in those amazing international results versus Koreans, and would have been considered an even greater team. But the fact that they were so good and then went home and Gambit could beat them most occasions or in the big moments was significant for Gambit and their greatness. Fnatic 2015, the one that went 18-0 in the regular split of the summer season of Season 5. They wouldn't have been as great if Origin hadn't have come along with Xpeke and Sven and Soaz and Amazing and Mythy, because that team showed that it wasn't that they were just beating up on a H2K that didn't have the same talent, or beating up on a Gambit that couldn't get all the pieces together at the right time, or beating up on much worse teams. They were beating up on a team that had experience, that had fantastic players, that had also a pretty decent understanding of how to play the game, and could take them close, but couldn't beat them in the really important moments. Obviously did beat them in a few games in the final, which made that victory more impressive than if they'd have just swept the whole playoffs and the regular season, as counterintuitive as that might sound. Likewise, TSM's return to glory from the time when C9 was on top was made much better by the fact that Cloud9, in its different iterations, with Hai and with Jensen, were able to get back to that final stage and contend TSM for those titles. And in terms of Jensen, have their own superstar MVP player who could have been the MVP of the whole league and the best player in the West, etc., etc. But TSM were able to best them. So for Bjergsen and for TSM, that was a significant rival they needed. In Quake, obviously, we had Rafa and Cypher, the two dominant players, but at different periods. And the way they dominated forced the other one to elevate their game, to work on certain weaknesses, to return to the top again, instead of just becoming lackadaisical, just being like, I'm on top, I'm the best, I can just sort of rest on my laurels, I can beat this opponent over here, I can lose the odd tournament because I can always come back. No, when another guy comes up who's your chief rival, he's not just beating you, he's beating everyone, and now he's the dominant player. You've got to overhaul your game. You've got to step your level up if you want to get back to the top again. It's not just about, oh, well, I'll win a tournament soon enough. That's not good enough. In Brood War, one of the most competitive games of all time, South Korean StarCraft Brood War, we had some amazing rivalries. So the most misunderstood rivalry of all time, I'll probably do a video on this at some point, is Boxer and Yellow. So that's the Lim Jin Rock or whatever they called it. Now, what people don't understand about that is because Boxer won all the big matches in the WCGs and the OSLs and the KPGA Tour, the predecessor to the MSL, people naively think, right, Boxer used to just straight own Yellow and smash him every time. By the time they'd retired, their win record in terms of offline official games played against each other was incredibly close. Boxer was narrowly ahead in that win record. Now, what happened was, Boxer often won the high-profile big matches, Yellow won a lot of the other matches, and all the side smaller tournaments and exhibition tournaments, and therefore they ended up with this very close record, and that's why Boxer was so great. It wasn't that he just smashed this guy and owned him completely. It's that, first of all, in the clutch big moments, he was able to be the one who came up clutch every time, even though Yellow was extremely good, and also he had this opponent who could beat him, and who absolutely was able to beat him and thought he could beat him and thought it should be his era and his time, and then he was able to overcome this guy in the most important, significant moments. That's what makes Boxer truly great, beyond his contributions to the game, his innovations, and his own period of dominance. One of my favourite rivalries, one of the most underreported, because everyone remembers Boxer Yellow at the beginning of the game, everyone remembers Flash Jading at the end. For me, the most underrated rivalry in Brood War history is I Love Uv, the great Terran player, the Gorilla Terran, the Cheetah Terran, the Macro Terran, versus July Zerg, the God of War, because they had such countervailing styles. I mean, what's great about this rivalry is I Love Uv was the dominant force. No one could budge him. And in TVZ, he was godlike. He was unbeaten. He was on like 21 game winning streak. Along came July, not just a Zerg, but a hyper-aggressive Zerg. A Zerg who didn't try to just play a straight-up macro game, who could beat you with raw micro and incredibly ballsy timing pushes. And because all of his strengths lined up with the few areas where there were weaknesses or opportunities against I Love Uv, and I Love Uv obviously famously wasn't very good in terms of raw micro and in terms of raw mechanics, and had to kind of macro up using deception sometimes to get to those points in the game, July was able to beat him, was able to take him close. And then when I Love Uv could win these matches, it meant even more for him, just as it meant more for July when July was able to beat I Love Uv and win big titles. So another factor that this elucidates, actually, which is a key factor as well, is it can also be very key to have a rival, because if your weakness turns out to be their strength, it now forces you to elevate further, work on your weakness, begin to neutralize that strength of the opponent, which is your weakness, start to craft that into more of a strength, or at least an okay factor, rather than just being able to rest upon your win condition, which is whatever your main strength is, and use that as a crutch. That's why even great players in eras where they're not properly tested don't necessarily show us everything that was in the tank, everything they were capable of. Likewise, the same goes for the Rafa and Cypher example, because Rafa's main source of weakness was raw aim, was ability to hunt people down when they were out of control, and instead he would play safe and he would set up his traps and he would bring you, know that you'd have to fight for control. Well, Cypher was a god of aim and was amazing at playing out of control and didn't need control in the same degree. And so once Cypher got all his shit together and got over his mental issues, now he could absolutely be a hard counter for Rafa, and actually that made Rafa really elevate some qualities of his game. So obviously another one from Brood War is Flash and Jaedong, because I mean, Flash was amazing early on. Well, he started off as a prodigy, but then Jaedong took over as the complete clutch player who was winning the big tournaments. Then Flash came along later, had to overcome Jaedong as like a final boss himself to get to the top. Then when he did, he was doing it against Jaedong every time. One of the all-time great players, one of the greatest winners we've ever had, one of the most clutch players. And that meant so much more. And that's why Flash is considered God and the best player ever and someone who solved Brood War. Because he wasn't just playing against a field of very good players like Nada was at certain points in time. He was dominating someone else who was set to become on a trajectory the greatest player to ever live. And I would even argue still might even be the second best player to ever play Brood War if we got into all the real weeds and we got into all the details. So another factor that I love about why you need the great rival and why it makes you greater is because when two elite players play each other, I noticed this is a very weird phenomenon because intuitively you would expect players to play worse on stage, to play worse when all the money's on the line, when they're playing a rival who they know if they beat them, then this accounts for that guy's legacy and as a knock against you. Bizarrely, the really great players in these moments shine even brighter. It pushes both players to a higher level. Both start doing amazing shit even they don't know they can do because they know it's required of them to potentially win this game. And so no matter who wins, both players showcase greatness in a way they wouldn't in a mismatch or against a lesser opponent who they could comfortably beat. I mean, a classic example of this would be the Federer-Nadal rivalry, where even though Nadal has won most of the time, all the time they would play would have amazing games. They had some unreal back-to-back moments. I mean, I remember in the Wimbledon 2008, the tiebreaker on the fifth set, where Nadal does this ridiculous return down the line, or maybe it was cross-court actually, and then it was Federer comes back with this ludicrous backhand was his weakness at the time that Nadal was serving to. He does this ludicrous backhand straight down the line with championship point for Nadal to save the game and to extend it further, and obviously Nadal, spoiler, ends up winning that particular match, often considered the greatest match of all time. Well, funnily enough, as someone who's watched practically all of the big games in Federer's career, I can tell you Federer played better in some of his epic losses to Nadal than he did when he used to just dominate 2004, 2007, where he, in terms of genius, in terms of shot making, in terms of serve, in terms of forehand, in terms of athletic ability, he was actually at a higher peak versus an entire field who collectively couldn't stand against him and who could rarely actually throw up consistent rivals beyond Roddick on grass, really. So, funnily enough, when he played some of these amazing losses, like the Wimbledon 2008 final, which had some amazing games, really tested Federer's clutch ability, the Australian Open 2009 final, which had some insane shot making by Federer, still wasn't enough because of the stamina and sheer grinding ability of Nadal. The French Open 2011 final, where he'd beaten Djokovic in that epic semi-final, he came in, he played so amazing for the first three sets, he could have won 3-0. He ended up losing 1-3 in sets because of Nadal's ability to come back, to stay in games, to stay in sets, and to crawl back in from seemingly lost positions. Likewise, Australian Open 2012 semi-final between Nadal and Federer. Absolutely unbelievable game. Federer again puts himself in position to win at time versus any other mortal, but Nadal is exactly the right player to play him, to match up, to have strengths which play into his weaknesses with the double-handed backhand and serving to his weak side and serving to him, so he has to hit a backhand himself. I mean, the Rafa versus Cypher one is a great one because they were not only rivals for their overall game, but again, it forced both of them to go to new levels and to beat each other and supersede each other in different ways. Cypher had to become more tactical, had to play more around control and understanding armor timings. Rafa had to step up his gun skills in the latter years to have a chance of beating Cypher, to occasionally beat Cypher. Now, what's funny is this principle and this trend is actually something I observed from MMA, from mixed martial arts, from the UFC, because back in 2010, the middleweight champion was arguably the greatest MMA fighter ever, Anderson Silva. And he was a phenomenal middleweight. In 2010, after UFC 112, where he beat Damian Maia in the title fight, he had seemingly grown bored with the division and where he was at in the sport. He had completely cleaned out the division. That's why they'd had to put Damian Maia there, who'd been knocked out by Nate Marquardt not that long earlier. They had to put him in there because Nate Marquardt couldn't make it to fight against and lost against Chael Sonnen. But Anderson Silva had already beaten Nate Marquardt, so people thought having a new fight against him is more entertaining than seeing somebody he already beat comprehensively. So he seemed like a guy who, in terms of how he fighted, didn't look like he gave a fuck anymore. This was the 6th time he'd defended his title. In between, he'd gone up for funsies to light heavyweight and beaten 2 bigger light heavyweights with ease and completely humiliated them going in the fucking Matrix. But you know what? Because he was so lackluster and it just was so far ahead of the division, he started to have shit title fights people wouldn't want to pay money for. People were getting bored of these fights. People were booing. The Tires Lates one. There was the Damian Maia one, as I mentioned here, where he could have easily won these fights. He could have easily finished some of these guys, but they were boring fights, and he just sat back trying to counterpunch. If the guy had ever given him a chance, he'd have knocked him out, but otherwise he wasn't going to risk anything. He was just going to win the title fight. He was going to collect his massive appearance fee, his win bonus, and he was going to go home, and he wasn't going to have great fights. And he'd become, as a result, especially because of the way he taunted Damian Maia, he'd actually become a villain. People no longer actually liked him in the same way. And he was, unfortunately, because he didn't have great English and the kind of charisma to pull off being a villain, it's not like he could then play that up and be a Floyd Mayweather and people want to tune in and pay to see you lose. No, so actually he was in a bad spot. And Dana White, the UFC commissioner, was thinking like, fucking hell, what am I to do here? But then into his lap fell the perfect panacea for all that ailed Anderson Silva in the middleweight division, Chael Sonnen, a wrestler, but who had now figured out how to talk shit, becoming the ultimate heel and make people want to see his fights. And he brought Anderson Silva out of his funk because he made people love Anderson Silva again, realize how great Anderson Silva was because of how much shit Chael Sonnen talked and how much of a villain Chael Sonnen was willing to be. In wrestling terminology, as in traditional wrestling, fake wrestling, WWE, as opposed to traditional wrestling, he put Anderson Silva over again and made Anderson Silva the babyface again. Because when he talked all this shit, people now wanted to see Chael Sonnen lose. They wanted Anderson Silva to win. Then, when he was beating the dog shit out of Anderson Silva and dominating him in every possible scoring context in MMA scoring, when then Anderson Silva pulled off that incredible comeback triangle submission with broken ribs, that made it even more epic. That was something we'd never seen from Anderson Silva. He normally dominated fights or easily, comfortably, at a canter beat people. Now he was pushed to his limit and by any kind of scoring system would definitely have lost that fight if it had gone the distance. And he won in epic, unexpected fashion where he had to really dig even deeper in a way we'd never seen from him. We'd never seen that level of heart from him before. So we think of some of these other great players and how their rival elevated their greatness. So Cypher was already an amazing, truly great player in 2008 in Quake 3. But if he hadn't have gone through the hard times of Rafa being the dominant player for the first year and a half for Quake Live, Rafa beating him in the big moments, it wouldn't have made him better. It wouldn't have made him get to a level where he had to now overtake Rafa and battle through Rafa's strengths and dominate Rafa to now win all those titles like he did in 2011, 2012. You think of Flash. Flash was a prodigy early on. It was absolutely fantastic and could have won championships early on in 2007. But it wasn't until Jadon came along and had won 4, then 5 titles after the Nate MSL that suddenly the pressure was really on Flash because now he not only isn't winning titles, but now Jadong's getting even further ahead of him. At that point, Jadong was something like, I think it was 3 titles ahead of him. Flash had only just won his second big title at the OSL that took place a week before the Nate MSL. And the way he lost the Nate MSL, that humiliating fashion, that fashion where he seemed like he mentally crumbled, meant he had to address that element of his game. He couldn't just be a brilliant player, but who sometimes lost the plot mentally. And so because Jadong had been better than him for the first half of their careers, he had to go to a whole new level we've never seen in Korean Brood War to supersede Jadong, who, as I said, was on a trajectory to be the best player ever, and become the dominant player of this second half of their careers and the ending era of Brood War, essentially. Now, I've just launched a Patreon for people who follow my work and who want to support it directly financially. And as I point out in the post, to do with the Patreon, the link's in the description box below. Don't feel obliged to do it if you're in any sort of financial trouble. But if you're someone who directly wants to support my career and my work, and you see some of the rewards and you want to activate some of these rewards, then feel free to donate whatever amount you want via my Patreon.